and welcome to Lesson 5 in this series. We're going to be looking at CISC and RISC. Don't have a Scooby? Stay tuned. You'll be an expert in about 20 minutes, or hopefully a bit quicker if I can talk fast. Every CPU has an instruction set. This is all the instructions written in machine code that can be executed by the CPU. Different CPU designs have a different core instruction set. So for example, your PC will understand one set of instructions, your tablet or your phone will have CPUs that understand a different instruction set. So when I talk about these instructions, I'm not talking about the programming code that's written in a high-level language like Java or C# or VB or something like that. We're talking about the machine code instructions that the CPU can execute. Okay? All CPU designs belong roughly to one of two main categories. So we've got CISC and RISC. CISC stands for Complex Instruction Set Computer. RISC stands for Reduced Instruction Set Computer. Question. So this is the kind of big question behind CISC and RISC, the rivalry, the benefits and downsides. The philosophy behind all this is it better to make more complicated instructions available inside the CPU that take many clock cycles to complete? Or is it better to restrict yourself to a smaller, simpler instruction set where each instruction only takes one cycle to complete? Which is better? Well, it depends, kind of. It's complicated, like most issues. But these questions are what's really behind this difference between CISC and RISC. They are two different design philosophies that are trying to achieve a similar end. Up until fairly recently, and as an older person, that means the mid-2000s, so not like last year or anything, up until fairly recently, the major chip makers preferred the CISC approach. While there were RISC computers back in the 90s and even in the 80s, the CISC approach was the one that most people followed when designing CPUs. If you know a little bit about technology, you know there was a major shift in how we use technology in the mid-2000s that made RISC processors really popular. If you can't work out what that is, I'll explain it as we go through the lesson. So looking at CISC, each generation of CISC chips offered larger and richer instruction sets compared to the one before. So when you bought your new computer every couple of years, that CPU would understand more instructions. It'd be a more complex CPU that had a larger, richer instruction set. But from the mid-2000s, the RISC approach has become very fashionable, and a lot of the computer devices that are made use RISC processors now. Why? Well, let's find out. Let's go through CISC in a bit more detail. So let's imagine I want to multiply two numbers A and B. In a CISC chip, there is a single instruction available. So for example, mult AB that will multiply value A and value B together. So it's only one instruction. However, it may take many clock cycles to carry out. Multiplication is quite difficult. It's more difficult than addition or subtraction because multiplication is repeated addition. So there's one instruction, it's nice and convenient, but it could take lots of clock cycles to carry out. The chip maker adds more and more complex hardware circuits within the CPU to carry out these complex instructions. So again, a reminder, I'm not talking about programming for it in a high-level language like, say, Python. We're thinking about the actual instructions available in machine code. So when you run your program or when you write your program in Python or C++ or something like that, it has to be converted into machine code before it can run. And we're talking about that final stage, the machine code. So the trade-off with CISC is between more complex hardware so that you can support simpler software coding. So with a CISC chip, you have a more complicated processor, more transistors, but that means you have simpler software. When you compile your high-level code and get it in machine code, it's easier for the compiler because there are more instructions for more complicated tasks available. So typically, CISC chips have large amounts of different and complex instructions available. The philosophy behind this is that the hardware is always faster than the software. Therefore, we should have a powerful instruction set which provides programmers with complex instructions to do a lot in a very short program. Most desktops and laptops that we use in homes and offices are CISC based, usually around Intel's x86 platform. But that may be beginning to change for laptops. RISC has certain advantages that mean it might be better for a laptop to run a RISC system rather than CISC. But yeah, if you're running any sort of Windows-based platform, like a typical laptop or a typical desktop computer, it's going to be CISC. And we'll look at why that is a little bit later on. RISC. RISC is a type of microprocessor architecture that utilizes a small but highly optimized set of instructions. It lets the hardware be simple, but it means the software has to be more complicated. There's more work on the compiler to take the high-level code and convert it to machine code. So for example, in our simplified, abstract view of RISC and CISC, let's imagine there is no single multiply instruction available on our RISC system. So the compiler has to generate more lines of code to perform the multiplication. So instead of having one line of code, now we're going to have 4 lines of code. So for example, load A from memory into register 1. Load B from memory into register 2. Take the product of register 1 and register 2, multiply them together, and then store answer back into memory. So on our RISC chip, we want to multiply 2 numbers together. That's 4 lines of code, whereas before with our CISC chip, it was only 1 line of code. So we're going from 1 instruction to 4. However, because it's a RISC processor, each of these instructions is a single clock cycle. So remember, with the CISC, we only had 1 instruction, but that might take multiple clock cycles. Here we have 4 steps, but each one we know is only going to be a single clock cycle. The philosophy behind RISC is that complex instructions are not used frequently. So if you look at the instruction set on a modern CISC processor, like a kind of modern Intel chip, there's a huge range of instructions that aren't going to be used very often. Therefore, fewer, simpler, and faster instructions would be better than a large, complex, and slower CISC instruction set. However, the downside is that each instruction, more instructions, are needed to accomplish the task. So you've got that kind of fairly big difference between CISC and RISC. CISC has lots of very complex instructions, so the code is very concise. We've got all these built complex instructions that can be used by the compiler, but each of these instructions can take many, many clock cycles to carry out. With the RISC, we have a small optimized set of instructions that each can be carried out in exactly 1 clock cycle. Another advantage of RISC is that because there are simpler instructions, RISC chips require fewer transistors. They're less complex. This means they are easier to design, smaller in size, more power efficient, cheaper to produce. So if you think about that, these are the kind of characteristics that we want in mobile devices, isn't it? We want our phones and our tablets to be small, power efficient, and cheap. So RISC has a lot of these important advantages that mean they're really good for mobile devices. And again, all of this is because the RISC system, a RISC CPU, requires fewer transistors. That means it's easier to design, smaller in size, more power efficient, and cheaper to produce. Also, because RISC instructions usually just take a single clock cycle, they are very well suited to pipelining. We'd often talk about the classic RISC pipelining system. So if you're not sure about pipelining, that was in one of my previous videos. Pipelining helps make maximum efficiency of a CPU, and RISC is very well suited to pipelining. Of course, modern CISC systems also use pipelining, but RISC is much better suited to pipelining because in a classic RISC system, each instruction is one single clock cycle, which means you can get the pipeline going really easily. On the other hand, the compiler for a RISC system has a harder job, as it has to determine how the functionality specified in the high-level code can be built from a limited set of available instructions. So you've written your code in whatever language you're using, then the compiler has a tough job trying to get that high-level functionality carried out in a series of very, very simple steps, because the RISC system has a less complex instruction set than a CISC-based platform. So again, with RISC, simpler hardware, but the software has a more complicated task on its hands. So, common features of RISC processors: you're going to have a larger number of general-purpose registers to prevent interactions with memory. Okay, you don't want to go back and forth to memory too often. That slows down the system, so you can have more general-purpose registers in a RISC processor. You're also going to have fewer addressing modes available. If you don't know what that is, don't worry. We'll cover that later when we start looking at software development. Addressing mode is just how a low-level program can specify how to address memory locations. And there are different ways that can be done. We'll explain more about that in a future video, but just now, RISC has fewer addressing modes than CISC, so that could be a disadvantage. Of course, most mobile devices used today are RISC-based systems, usually based on a design by a company called ARM, A-R-M, and they design processors that are then manufactured by other companies. So again, RISC phones, RISC tablets, most of the phones and tablets that you can buy are using a RISC architecture. Remember, they're smaller, less complicated, more power efficient, cooler than a CISC system. There is still considerable controversy about experts about which architecture is better. Some say that RISC is cheaper and faster, and therefore it is the architecture of the future. But people have been saying that since the 1980s. Others note that by making the software simpler, RISC puts a greater burden on the software. Compilers generate more code than the CISC equivalent. RISC has been around for a long time. I think it says 25 years here. It's probably a lot longer now. And while RISC has been available for a long time, I remember my computer had a Archimedes computer back in the early 1990s, which was a RISC-based computer. Despite RISC being around for a long time, CISC still dominates many sections of the market. If we look at the market for PC workstations, servers, the majority of processors are running CISC architecture. So CISC is still a very big deal in lots of areas. Part of this is just because traditionally, Windows by Microsoft won't run on a RISC platform. And we want to be able to run all our old PC programs and not to have to abandon everything we've ever done and start again. So if you think about big business enterprise, they've got loads of custom-written software that runs on Windows-based CISC platforms. They don't want to spend millions redeveloping all that software so it runs on RISC. So they still want to use this traditional processor type using Microsoft Windows as their operating system. I think Microsoft is looking at getting Windows running on RISC platforms. That's a very complex thing to do. You've also got companies like Intel and AMD that manufacture CISC processors, what we often call the x86 platform or the modern x64 platform. These guys have a vested interest in making sure we stay with CISC rather than moving over to RISC, which are designed by ARM and manufactured by other companies. We've also got the idea that RISC and CISC architectures are becoming more and more alike. They are converging. Many of today's RISC chips support as many instructions as yesterday's CISC chips. So the instructions provided by modern RISC chips are becoming more complex, as we expect the chips to do more and more complex tasks. On the other hand, CISC CPUs are becoming far more power efficient. So if you look at the last few generations of Intel processors, they're not necessarily getting faster, but they're getting much more power efficient, so they can compete more with RISC chips. So simply said, RISC and CISC are converging towards each other. Maybe in the future, there's not going to be such a distinction. And to summarize, here's a table just going through some of the key points about CISC and RISC. It summarizes everything I've gone through. Take a look at it, make some notes. Make sure you're confident to describe the difference between a classical CISC system and a classical RISC system. I'll be back in a week or two. Good luck with your studies.